Hello, welcome to Virginia Time Travel, your portal to the Commonwealth's past, present, and future. When we look at the Civil War, we are now in the midst of the 150th anniversary. But as people start learning more about this particular conflict, which has been described as the greatest conflict ever to come within American soil, they're discovering that, surprise, surprise, there's more to this war than meets the eye. Professor Robert Harsh at George Mason University once said, quote, "If you plan on learning everything there is to know about the Civil War, you can't do it in a single lifetime. It's going to take more than just one." As a result, a lot of folks who think they know everything about the war are being surprised, as there's a lot more details in it than is to be expected. One detail that most people seem to forget is the year 1861. Yes, we know about the first Battle of Bull Run. Yes, we know that the war started then. But there are surprisingly other details involved in this particular time period that most people don't know. Joining us today is Robert Alton. He is the author of the book Stratagem 1861, which delves into the first year of the conflict and goes ahead and shows us that things could have been very different had history just gone also a little bit differently. So Robert, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much.
Now, 1861, important year. North and South are pretty much even on the war. You know, North has about 12,000 men in their army. South has about 10,000 men. So, you know, you're pretty much at the perfect point. Anyone could win. What made you interested in this particular year?
You know, it started in 2005. I was in downtown Manassas visiting a store there, Rebel Coin on Battle Street. And the proprietor, a gentleman by the name of Jimmy Wilson, had this array of Civil War artifacts and what we refer to as relics for display on his shelves. And so a conversation ensued. I asked Jimmy, you know, where he found or came about to have these artifacts, and he explained the hobby of relic hunting to me. And from that conversation, Jimmy asked me in turn where I lived, and I explained to him eastern Prince William County, and he then relayed much of that region's history, that portion of Prince William County. And it was fascinating to me because, like most people that are into Civil War history, I was familiar with Gettysburg and First Manassas or First Bull Run and many of the major battlefields, but I had no inkling, never had any access to information regarding some of the lesser known events in the Eastern Theater, particularly Prince William County, Leesburg, Manassas, and so forth. And so that early conversation with Jimmy turned into me purchasing my first metal detector and exploring the woods of what was left at that time in 2005 of Prince William County. And so as I found an artifact, whether it be a coat button, a bullet, what have you, I would do research and try to identify what was the overall context. If it was a state button, was it from Georgia? Was it from New York? And then I would progress and identify what regiment it may have come from. And in this fashion, over about the course of a year, I started to compile more and more information and a greater context and a greater understanding for what the topic of the book eventually became, which was the battle for the Potomac River.
Now, most people are not really familiar with military conflicts occurring at the Potomac River. We usually just think, oh, it's the river's there. If you're driving along the George Washington Parkway, you might see Fort Washington if you're actually turning to the right while driving along. What is the Battle of the Potomac River exactly?
It's the best question, and I was just like all of those people. I had never heard about it, and it's not something that's taught in schools, and it's not in most history books. Theories abound as to why. As we get into the topic, many historians believe that perhaps the Lincoln administration and the Union in general were embarrassed by the results of the battle for the Potomac River, also known as the blockade of the Potomac. So that may be one reason, and the Union eventually won the war, and the victor gets to write the history books on what occurred. And so that particular chapter of Civil War history is just a lesser known event. And what I discovered through my research is that in early 1861, right around October, the Confederate Army had an early presence in Northern Virginia, and it was a 50-mile front that stretched from Leesburg on the left all the way down towards Dumfries on the right. And their primary purpose at that juncture in the war was to establish a defensive perimeter to prevent the Union Army from crossing into Virginia, via the Potomac River. Mm-hmm. The Union Army was engaged in much the same thing. They were setting up the defenses of Washington, D.C. But these two battle lines are essentially where things began in 1861.
Now, since you said that basically the right flank, that whole extreme right is in Dumfries, Virginia, most folks don't necessarily know where Dumfries is. So if you were to paint a picture of the map of Virginia and you have the Potomac River, for a geographical marker, where is Dumfries located exactly?
Dumfries, it's in eastern Prince William County, and it's nestled along some rolling hills that are right along the Potomac River. If you were to look at it on a map, it would be midway between Occoquan to the north and Stafford or Aquia to the south.
Okay. Now, with Dumfries right there in the middle, what made that particular point seemingly important? I mean, it's right on the Potomac, but I mean, you could easily go up to Occoquan, and that's big because you got that river there. And you could go a little further south, and I'm sure we can find another little creek bed or something like that. But why Dumfries? Why is that one the biggie?
And that's a great question, and it gets to the crux of the topic of the book. In early 1861, the railroads that existed at that time terminated in Aquia. From there, they continued on south to Richmond, but they terminated at Aquia. And from there north until you reach Manassas, eastern Prince William County was void of any rail. It was sort of a no man's land. It was barren. And what the Confederate Army was engaged in early 1861 was initially to set up a defensive posture along the terminus of the RFMP, Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Petersburg Railroad that was at Aquia, to protect it as they shipped supplies south towards Richmond, their capital. And so what they found in this no man's land was that there was these promontories along the river, namely Cockpit Point and Freestone Point batteries in eastern Prince William, that had a very commanding view of the Potomac. And so it wasn't too long before they realized that they could harass the commercial traffic that was moving up and down the river to supply Washington, D.C. Because in those days, in the absence of rail, the river was a major thoroughfare that supplied the nation's capital with goods and commerce from around the world. Coffee, sugar, grain, you name it.
Mm-hmm. Now, with these coastal batteries being able to harass a ship, how effective were they in harassing? Was this, because I mean, if you read accounts from the American Revolution, Henry Knox had very proudly said he could sink any British ship, and then when the British came, he couldn't hit them to save his life. I mean, how effective were these cannons by this point?
In terms of commercial traffic, to have a large vessel laden with hundreds of thousands of pounds of goods, and let's just pick one, coffee, let's say, moving upriver against the current to make a delivery to Washington, D.C., those ships were moving very slowly. So they made an easy target, and it was a precarious situation for them. And that was realized very early by the Secretary of the Navy, the U.S. Navy, Gideon Welles. And so as the situation progressed with these batteries on the Virginia shore, firing at these commercial vessels, and there's several instances of them striking them, it wasn't long before Gideon Welles ordered the closure of the river. Now, on the other hand, there was the faster moving U.S. Navy ships that, as they left Washington, D.C., sailing down the river, oftentimes towards the Chesapeake and then towards the Atlantic, to engage in blockading activities to prevent commerce from coming into the southern states from Europe, those ships could move much faster, so they weren't in that much danger. However, in the book, I summarized several battles, roughly 8, that were between the U.S. Navy and the Confederate batteries, and there was several examples in the book where even the U.S. Navy ships that were firing at the batteries received counter battery fire and had to return to the Washington Navy Yard for repairs.
Now, so let me go ahead and paint the picture here and get an idea of everything. So it's October 1861. You've got cannon batteries on the Virginia shoreline pointing out towards the Potomac River. It's harassing commercial traffic. It's harassing U.S. naval warships, which cannot put them out of business. And effectively, if you're a northerner who's living in Maryland or if you're living in D.C., you've got a real problem on your hands, because Dumfries, Virginia, which is seemingly where they're based out of, is about a good 30 miles, give or take?
30 miles from the nation's capital, not far at all.
So, I mean, and you could probably hear that on a good clear day. Those cannons going off. Might think it's thunder, but you could probably hear it. So, if you're Abraham Lincoln, this is pretty embarrassing. So, what's his plan going to be?
Lincoln, at this point in the war, relied upon General McClellan initially, and one of the interesting things is one of Lincoln's more commonly known phrases regarding General McClellan came about from this period, which is, if McClellan does not want to use the Army, I should like to borrow it for some time. And what he was saying by that is that McClellan was mainly focused on setting up the defenses of Washington, D.C. He considered the batteries in Virginia a nuisance, but not necessarily as much of a threat as the U.S. Navy considered it to be, and rightly so. Eventually, with other events that happened during the period of October 61 to March of 1862, it grew beyond just a blockade. As the commercial vessels were forbidden from traveling up and down the river, the price of goods and services in Washington, D.C. skyrocketed, and it got to the point where they paid more for coffee per pound than we do today. And so if you can imagine that with inflation, it was just astronomically embarrassing, for the administration. Not to mention, there were several battles that the Union Army lost. Ball's Bluff in October of 61 was a huge defeat. And several other engagements in the Northern Virginia area. And so you have this blockade, several battles lost on the mainland, in the midst of a rising federal debt. I summarize an event in the book regarding the Trent Affair that occurred off the coast of Cuba. It was a political international crisis. So all these things are happening right around the same time, and President Lincoln is growing more and more frustrated with General McClellan.
Well, who would have thought, first of all, that Starbucks would actually have cheaper coffee than somebody
right.
else? Who knew? Okay, so you've got these two little cannon batteries. Now, how big is a battery?
Well, first there was actually, in total, and over the period of a few months, the northernmost battery was at Freestone Point. From there, as you traveled south along the river and you arrived near Dumfries, there was Cockpit Point. Just south of Cockpit Point, there were two more batteries, one at Shipping Point and the other at Evansport. So there were four major or main batteries along the river at those locations. Each one had a combination of 9-inch Dahlgren cannons, 32-pound and 42-pound Seacoast guns that they had seized at the Norfolk Naval Yard when the U.S. Navy abandoned it in April of 61. The Confederates were able to go there, and while all the stores and things burned to the ground, the cannons remained usable. And so the Confederates employed those along the batteries. In total, along these four principal locations, they had some 37 heavy guns, roughly 4 at Freestone Point Battery, 4 at Cockpit Point Battery, and then the remainder were shared between Shipping Point and Evansport. The lower two batteries are located on what is today Quantico Marine Corps Base. Okay,
so I mean, there's a lot of firepower there, and how many men would be stationed at these positions? I mean, cannons are very important, and it doesn't really matter what time period. I mean, it's still very important pieces. So how many men would you station there?
Generally speaking, it was one regiment that would support each battery, but not the entire regiment was there to man the guns. Typically, it would be about a company or 100 soldiers or slightly less than that manning the guns at any one given point in time. However, because the numbers at Shipping Point and Evansport of cannons were far greater than they were at Cockpit Point and Freestone Point. You know, if there was a half a company at Cockpit Point, there would be a full company at Shipping Point.
Okay. So it's a relatively small number of men, but with a lot of firepower at their disposal. You know, if I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, you know, you were able to send in a small regiment of men to take Alexandria just a couple months earlier. Why not just go in with a couple river pontoon boats, just go running right on up and seize the guns? What's stopping the Union Army from doing that? Is it General McClellan just deciding to, you know, just be McClellan, or did nobody actually think that far ahead?
As the winter progressed and the effects of the battery were cause for concern in Washington, D.C. and in the region, eventually that question was asked. And one of the generals that came forward with the plan, General Joseph Hooker, located with his division at Budd's Ferry, Maryland, just across the river from Dumfries. He did have a plan. It was a three-phased approach. He would send 2 companies across the river in a night movement to strike at the batteries, one at Freestone Point, the other one at Cockpit Point. He would send half of a brigade towards Aquia Creek Landing to attack the batteries there. And then the third phase of his approach, he would send the remainder of his division, roughly 8,000 soldiers at that point, towards Cockpit Point Battery. What's interesting about this is I found in my research the Confederate general in the Dumfries sector was by the name of General William H.C. Whiting. He was a former Army officer, graduated first in his class at West Point, and he just had this acute sense that the Federals were planning an attack December of 61 and January of 62. And so he constantly had his troops in muster and drilling and preparing for what he believed was an imminent assault. And in my research, I located his defensive strategy, assuming that the Federals were going to attack. He laid out his plans. And what General Whiting indicated was that he wasn't too concerned with the heavy guns at Cockpit Point, at Freestone Point, and the other batteries. He believed that they were too heavy to move, and they would, like, as you relayed, with a heavy force of infantry, they would be too hard to defend. And so in his proposal to General Joseph E. Johnston, who was commanding the Confederate forces in Virginia at that time, he indicated that he would withdraw from the batteries in the event of a Federal attack, and then make his defensive position along the Telegraph Road in the dense and heavy brush and the rolling hills in eastern Prince William County. General Whiting had at his disposal the Texas Brigade, regiments like the 1st Texas, 4th Texas, 5th Texas Infantry regiments, the same soldiers that marched up the Little Round Top at Gettysburg. They were some of the toughest fighting units in the Army of Northern Virginia. And so he was ready for a fight, and his troops were too.
Okay, so both sides have a plan. Both sides are ready to commit. It definitely looks like it's going to be a pretty bloody battle. So what happens?
Basic military doctrine holds that an attacking force should have a 3-to-1 ratio greater than a defending force as just a basic military principle. So in this scenario, General Whiting has roughly 12,000 infantry under his command in the Dumfries sector. General Hooker, coming from Maryland as the attacker, should have had at least 36,000 to have that 3-to-1 ratio. He did not. He had roughly 8,500 remaining within his division after the forces that he had sent south towards Aquia. So his 8,500 attacking General Whiting's 12,000, who were on the high ground and had a number of field artillery at their disposal, in no uncertain terms would have spelled disaster for the Federal Army. And I believe, and I summarize it in the book, that it would have been very similar to the events at Ball's Bluff that previous October, where the Federal Army incurred a large dug-in Confederate defender and panicked and literally retreated down the tall bluffs and The situation there was that hundreds of soldiers drowned in the Potomac River trying to escape. I think they would have encountered a very similar, if not more, serious situation had they attacked Dumfries. And rightly so, General McClellan easily rejected Hooker's proposal, so it did not come to be. But it is one of the topics that I was able to take both of those plans in great detail and compare them in the book and devise several battle maps that are there, or scenarios.
Now, what ends up happening to the whole blockade in the end? Because clearly, if the North won, it's not there by the end of the war, and something has to happen to it. So why did the blockade break?
That is one of the principal questions that the historians that are aware of this campaign have asked, and I believe I've identified a few of the reasons. One of those, and probably the biggest reason, is logistics. Because there was no rail between Dumfries and Manassas, the Confederate Army, as they were supplied from Richmond, would send the goods north along rail to Aquia. From there, they had no way to distribute them other than on horseback and through wagons. So you can imagine in the winter, as the fall is coming to an end and we approach spring, the snow and the ice melt, the roads became impassable. They were a constant challenge for both armies in that region, and were a constant mud bog. And so these thousands of pounds of supplies that are sent to Manassas and sent to Aquia Creek Landing, they have very limited means to distribute those outward along that 50-mile front from Leesburg to Dumfries. And so supplies, lack thereof, was a major issue. And what I found in my research is that thousands of pounds of rations and other goods were laid to waste in railroad cars at Manassas and other locations because of that. So logistics was a key issue. What really brought it to a head, and it's one of the new areas that my book addresses, is events that were shaping up several hundred miles south of Dumfries, and that was along the Outer Banks in North Carolina. The Pamlico Sound and the Hatteras Inlet was the scene of constant attention in late 1861, early 1862. The Federal Army had been planning a way to assault the Confederate forts at Hatteras Inlet. If they were successful at taking them, they could enter the Pamlico-Albemarle Sound and eventually move their way inland towards Roanoke Island. From Roanoke Island, they could then land on the North Carolina mainland and move along the rail towards New Bern, from New Bern, North Carolina, towards Goldsboro, and eventually they would be within a half a day's rail transport to the Confederate capital in Richmond in this fashion. So it was an open back door, if you will, towards the Confederate capital, and it was great cause for concern because that is exactly what happened. The Federal Navy and the Federal Army coordinated in early 1862. They seized Hatteras Inlet, Forts Hatteras and Forts Clark. They moved inland towards Roanoke Island. They quickly took Roanoke Island, and the Confederates realized, General Johnston, President Davis, they had a war council in early 1862 and realized that the Federal Army was now within a half a day's march of Richmond. And so this gets to another key strategy in the book, is that another basic military doctrine or principle is, in order to win at war, you would either destroy your adversary by attacking the heart or the brain. In this scenario, the brain is the capital city. And so, Richmond, Washington, D.C. are under constant threat in that regard. The Confederates in Northern Virginia, in the Dumfries sector, in the absence of rail, were more than a day's march towards Richmond. And so they realized that they should move a little further south towards the Rappahannock River, just north of Fredericksburg, and that would put them within a half a day's march or equal movement to the Federal Army, now at Roanoke Island.
So certainly logistics and strategy and everything else that. I mean, it paints an amazing picture. And it's one of those campaigns you don't really think about and hear about, so it's really fascinating to look at. Now, for anyone who might be interested in learning more about your book or going online, is there a website that they can go ahead and check out?
There are several. I would say check out Facebook, Stratagem 1861 on Facebook. The books are also for sale on Amazon.com.
And you know, when it comes to looking at the Civil War during 1861, it's one of those things that we always wonder. The great what-ifs of history always come up, and people sometimes wonder, what if the Confederates were able to choke out D.C. and make it financially impossible to stay? If Lincoln was forced to move the capital, would that have gone ahead and brought about Confederate acknowledgement for Europe? Who knows? But there's a lot of things to consider. To learn more about Stratagem 1861, please visit our website, www.timetravel21.com, or email us at timetravel21@yahoo.com. And Robert, thank you so much for coming in. On behalf of us here at Virginia Time Travel, I want to give you a little token, Alexander 1861 to 1865.
All right.
And while he gets to learn more about Virginia history, we hope you'll come back and tune in once again so we can all go back in time.